Okay, so you're here because you want to quickly get your head around something important in tech, right?
Yep,
No fluff, just the essentials.
exactly.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into setting up existing Rails applications using development containers, dev
Right.
containers.
And this is a big one. I mean, have you ever spent just ages trying to get your local setup perfect?
Oh, tell me about it. Or wrestling with team setups.
Yeah, where everyone's got slightly different configs,
Yeah.
and then you get the classic, well, it works on my machine.
Yes.
The worst.
So dev containers are a really, really smart way to tackle that. They give everyone the same repeatable environment. Consistency.
And we're not just winging it here. We're basing this on a great article from fastruby.io that actually just came out today, April 17th, 2025.
That's right. Solid source.
Now, we should mention, if you're on the very latest Rails 8 or newer, you might see some of this stuff built in already.
True, there's some integrated support now. But our focus today is really for folks with existing Rails apps, maybe slightly older ones,
Yeah.
where you're trying to figure out how to get a standard dev setup going.
Exactly. So the mission, if you will, is pretty clear.
Yeah.
We want to really understand what dev containers are, fundamentally, and walk through setting up a, let's say, minimal but working example for an existing Rails app.
So people leave knowing the core ideas.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's unpack it then. What are dev containers? Because, like the article says, VS Code has that super popular extension.
Right, the dev containers extension.
So you might think, oh, this is just a VS Code thing.
Yeah, and that's a really common misconception. It's important to clear that up first,
Right?
at their heart. Dev containers are just Docker containers, standard Docker.
Ah, okay, so nothing magical.
Not really magical, no. Think of Docker containers like those lightweight boxes, right? They pack up everything your app needs, code, dependencies, tools.
So it runs the same everywhere, like a shipping container.
Exactly like a shipping container. Perfect analogy.
Mm.
So dev containers use standard Docker files, even docker-compose.yml files.
Which means,
Well, if you've already Dockerized your app, maybe for deployment,
yeah.
that existing setup, it can probably be your dev container, or at least the starting point.
Okay, so if it's just Docker, where does the dev part really shine? What makes it easy for editors?
That's the interesting bit. It comes down to adopting certain conventions,
Conventions, like rules.
sort of agreed upon ways of doing things, how you structure your project, your config files. These conventions let editors, IDEs with the right extensions, understand your setup easily.
So the tools know what to expect.
Precisely. It's that standardization that makes them user-friendly.
Okay, what are these key conventions then? What should we look out for?
But the first big one is the .dev container folder.
Right, I've seen that. .dev container.
Yeah, that's usually where you'll stick your Docker file and, importantly for Rails, your docker-compose.yml.
Why Docker Compose specifically?
Because most Rails apps need more than one container, right? You almost always need a database, maybe Redis, Sidekick.
Ah, right, multiple services.
Yeah, so putting these files in that specific .dev container folder. Editor extensions know exactly where to look. No guessing.
Got it. A standard location. What else?
The other really crucial piece is the devcontainer.json file.
Okay, devcontainer.json.
Exactly. Think of it like a manifest file. It describes the setup to your editor.
What kind of things does it describe?
Things like which Docker image to use or which Docker compose file, what commands to run after the container starts up,
Right.
even like useful editor extensions to install inside the container.
Okay. The article had a really simple devcontainer.json example. Can we break that down?
Absolutely. Let's look at it. It was something like this.
Yeah.
JSON.name, barebones devcontainer.build, Dockerfile context, .context.name, post create command, echo containers ready, post create command.
Okay, nice and simple.
Right. So name, that's just a label. Easy enough.
Yeah.
The build part tells Docker how to build the image. Dockerfile. Dockerfile points to the Dockerfile, usually in that same .dev container folder.
Makes sense. And context, what's that?
Good question. The context is basically the set of files Docker can see when it's building the image. Setting it to Dosh means the parent directory.
So the whole project.
Pretty much, yeah. It lets Docker access your entire Rails app code if needed during the build.
Okay. And post create command.
That's a command to run inside the container after it's successfully built and started. Here, it just prints a message, but it could be anything.
Like setup steps.
Exactly. We'll see more complex examples later.
Cool. So the article then mentioned how an editor uses this JSON file It runs Docker commands underneath, right?
Yeah, totally. It translates that JSON into actual Docker commands.
What would those look like for this simple example?
Okay, so first, to build the image, the editor would probably run something like docker build -f dash my dev container Dockerfile.
Let's break that down. -f is the file?
Yeah, the Dockerfile path, -tt, tags the image, gives it a name like my dev container.
And the adapt the end.
That's the build context again, usually the project root, aligning with that context if the commands run from the right place.
Okay, so that builds the image. Then how does it run it?
It would then do something like docker run.
Hmm.
It name my dev container instance -v ewd.workspace, my dev container.
Whoa, okay. Lots of flags there.
Yeah, let's quickly go through them. Docker run starts it. It makes it interactive, gives you a terminal.
Uh,
Name gives the running container a specific name.
okay.
And the FD part is super important. -v pwd.workspace. It's a volume mount.
Sharing files between my machine and the container.
Exactly. It links your current project directory, pwd, to a workspace directory inside the container. So your code changes show up instantly inside.
Nice. And the last part is just the image name we built earlier.
Yep, my dev container tells Docker which image to use.
Okay, so even that simple config gets a container running with my code inside. Cool. Now, Rails. How do we adapt this for a real Rails app?
Right. So the core steps are the same, like the article says. You make that .dev container folder.
Yep.
You put your Docker file in there. And crucially for Rails, you almost always need a docker-compose.yml too.
It's because of the database.
Exactly. Database, maybe Redis, whatever other services your app needs.
Mm-hmm.
Docker Compose is built for managing these multiple linked containers.
Makes sense. The article also brought up an entry point.esh script. What's that for?
Ah, the entry point script. It's a really neat way to automate setup tasks that need to run when the container starts.
Like what? For Rails.
Well, common things are running bundle install to get your gems
Okay.
and setting up the database. You know, Rails db.create, Rails db.migrate, stuff you'd normally do manually first time.
Gotcha. So the article showed an example Rails Dockerfile. Can we walk through that one?
Sure can. Let's see. It started with a Ruby base image,
Dockerfile.
3.3.0.
Right. Then it installed some packages using apt-get.
Dockerfile. Hashtag install essential packages, PostgreSQL client libraries, and Netcat. RUN, apt-get update, and apt-get install -y Node.js yarn. Build essential. libpqdev, Netcat traditional, nrm-rf, varlib apt lists.
Okay, so Node.js and Yarn for front-end assets, usually. Build essential for compiling stuff. libpqdev, that's key for talking to PostgreSQL.
Yeah, Netcat traditional.
We'll see that used in the entry point script. It's a little tool to check network connections, like seeing if the database is ready.
Ah, clever. Okay, what's next in the Docker file?
Installing Rails and bundler gems.
Docker file. Hashtag install Rails and bundler. RUN gem install Rails bundler.
Then setting the working directory inside the container.
Docker file. Hashtag set working directory. Work dir app name. Hashtag call the workspace dir whatever your application name is.
App name or whatever your app is called. Then copying and setting up that entry point script.
Docker file. Hashtag copy the entry point script to make it executable. Copy y entry point.sha or sr local band entry point.sha. RUN tomut the text usr local band entry point.sha. Hashtag set the entry point. No CMD here to auto run Rails.
Yep.
Entry point usr local band entry point.esh.
Right, so it copies entry point.sre into the container, makes it executable, and then sets it as the entry point.
Meaning that script runs automatically when the container starts.
Exactly. It's the first thing that executes.
Okay, so what does that entry point.sre actually do in the example?
Let's look at the script itself.
Bash. Hashtag.binbash.set.
Set E is good practice, makes the script exit immediately if any command fails, helps debugging.
Sensible.
Then,
First, bundle install.
echo, running, bundle install,
Gets all the gems. Then it waits for the database.
Echo, waiting for PostgreSQL to be ready at database host-db.5432. Echo, waiting for PostgreSQL to be ready at database host. Hashtag wait until the PostgreSQL service is accepting connections. While bandcz, 5432, to while while ncz, ndz database host, sleep 1, while ncz database host, done.
See? There's nc the netcat command. It loops, checking port 5432 on the database host, DB by default or whatever database host is set to.
Waits until it can connect.
Exactly. Once it connects, it knows the database is ready. Clever. And after the DB is ready,
It sets up the Rails database.
Bosh echo. PostgreSQL is ready.
Yeah.
Setting up the Rails database. Bundle exec Rails db.create. Bundle exec Rails db.migrate. Bundle exec Rails db. Echo Rails database setup complete.
Creates the database, runs migrations, the usual Rails setup.
And the last line?
Echo Rails database setup complete. Launching interactive shell.exec bash.
Mm-hmm.
Exec bash. This just drops you into an interactive shell inside the container once the setup is done.
So I can run Rails console or Rails server from
That's
there.
exactly. You're inside the container, ready to go.
That sequence makes a lot of sense. Dependencies, wait for DB, setup DD, give me a shell.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the docker-compose.yml, how does that tie the Rails app and the database together?
Right, the orchestrator. Let's look at the example docker-compose.yml
Yeah.
3.8.
Okay, version 3.8. Define services. First is web, that's our Rails app.
YAML.build.context.dockerfile.
The build section tells us to use the Dockerfile in the current directory, which in context means the .devcontainer directory where the compose file lives.
Got it. And volumes.
YAML.volumes.appname.cached.bundlecache.store vendor bundle. Two volumes here. The first one, .name.cached, mounts the parent directory, our whole project, into appname inside the container.
Just like the docker run -v command earlier.
Precisely. .cached is just an optimization hint. The second one, bundlecache.store vendor bundle, is interesting.
Named volume.
Yeah, it creates a persistent volume called bundle cache and mounts it where bundler installs gems inside the container.
So gems aren't lost when I stop the container.
Exactly. Saves re-downloading them every time. Big speed boost.
Smart. Okay, ports.
YAML.ports, 3000.3000. Simple port mapping. Host port 3000 to container port 3000 lets you access Rails server from your browser.
Standard Rails port. Then depends on.
YAML, depends on.db tells compose. Don't start the web service until the DB service is running. Essential for the interpoint script waiting logic.
Connects to the waiting loop. And environment variables.
YAML.environment. Database host DBD environment. Database username Postgres.environment. Database post.environment. Postgres.environment. Database name RailsDev.environment. Bundle path appname vendor bundle. Sets environment variables inside the web container. Database connection details, mostly, that Rails will use. Note database host DB matches the service name.
And bundle path matches that volume mount.
Yep. Keeps things consistent.
Okay, that's the web service. What about the DB service?
YAML DB image. Postgres.13 environment. Postgres user. Postgres. Postgres password. Postgres. Postgres DB Rails dev. Much simpler. It just uses the official Postgres.13 image directly from Docker Hub. No build needed. Sets environment variables for the Postgres user, password, and database name. These need to match what the web service expects.
And it also has a volume.
YAML.volumes.pd data.varley Postgres cruise data. Yes, another named volume, p data. This one persists the actual database files. Super important so you don't lose your data when you stop the container.
Right. Don't want to lose my test data. And the last bit.
YAML.pjada.bundlecache. This just formally defines those named volumes, pdata, and bundle cache that we used in the services.
Okay, that docker.compose.yml pulls it all together. So now the final piece, the devcontainer.json for this whole Rails setup. What does that look like?
Right, let's look at the Rails-specific devcontainer.json example.
JSON.name, Rails devcontainer, docker compose file, docker-compose.aml, service.web, workspace folder, app name.
Okay, name is clear. Now instead of build, we have docker compose file. Docker-compose.aml tells the editor, use this compose file.
And service.web.
Specifies that web is the main service we want to interact with, connect the editor to.
Workspace folder is the directory inside the container again.
Yep, app name, consistent with the Docker file and volumes. Then there's the customizations block.
Customizations, VS Code, extensions, rebornix.ruby optional, provides Ruby language support in VS Code. Rebornix.ruby optional, rebornix.ruby optional, but that's not optional, rebornix.ruby optional.
This is editor specific. Here, for VS Code, it suggests installing the Rebornix Ruby extension inside the container for better Ruby support.
But that part's optional.
Totally optional.
Yeah.
The environment works without it, but it's a nice to have for VS Code users. Other editors might have similar customization options.
And the post create command again?
JSON.postCreate command. Bundle install into Rails. db.create. db.migrate. Post create command. Yeah, notice here it repeats the setup commands from the entry point.esh.
Why repeat them?
Good question. You probably wouldn't need both. You could put them either in the entry point.esh or here in the post create command. It depends on when you want them to run. Post create command runs once after creation. Entry point runs every time the container starts, though db.create might fail safely if the db exists. Sometimes people put setup here if they want the editor to manage it.
Okay, so a bit of flexibility there. Choose one place.
Generally, yeah. Pick the one that makes sense for your workflow. Maybe entry point is better if you want it guaranteed every start.
Right. So we have the three files, Dockerfile, docker-compose.yml, devcontainer.json in the .devcontainer folder. How do we actually start this thing up using just Docker Compose commands, like the article showed?
Okay, manually you'd use two main commands. First, build the images, docker compose docker batch dev container docker-compose.yml build.
Do I run that every time?
No, just the first time. Or if you change the Dockerfile. Once the images are built, they're cached.
Okay, then to run it.
You'd use docker-compose-f.devcontainer docker-compose.yml run rm service ports web.
Let's see, service ports make sure the compose file.rmm removes the container when it stops.
Yep, keeps things tidy. Service ports make sure the ports defined in the compose file, like 3000, are actually mapped to your host machine. And web tells it which service from the compose file to run.
And that command will eventually drop me into the bash shell because of the exec bash in our entry point.
Exactly. The entry point script runs, does its setup, and ends with exec bash, giving you the prompt inside the web container.
Cool. And once that's running, how do I see my Rails app?
Simple. Open your browser and go to localhost strike 3000.
Because of the port mapping in the compose file?
You got it, 3000.3000. Your Rails server running inside the container on port 3000 is accessible on your machine's port 3000.
Sweet. What about tests? The article mentioned rspec. How do I run those?
Similar command, but you add the test command at the end, like docker-compose-f.devcontainer docker-compose.yml run rm service ports web bundle exec rspec.
So Docker Compose run again, but instead of just web, it's web bundle exec.
Right. It starts a new container, uses the web service definition, runs bundle exec rspec inside it, and then ARM cleans it up afterwards.
And the bundle exec is important.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah.
Make sure you're running the rspec or rake test, etc., that's installed via your gem file inside the container's environment.
Unless you've configured the path carefully inside the container.
Exactly. But bundle exec is generally the safer bet to avoid weird version issues.
Okay, this is great. We've gone from basics to a full Rails setup. What were the final takeaways or broader points from the article?
Well, one key point was acknowledging that, yes, VS Code with its extension makes this super smooth. It automates a lot of those Docker Compose commands.
Right. Click a button and it just works.
Pretty much.
Right.
But the beauty of this approach, even the manual commands we discussed, is that it's just Docker.
Meaning
It works across any editor or IDE. As long as your team members have Docker installed, they can use this setup. Doesn't matter if they use VS Code, RubyMine, Vim, Emacs, whatever.
That's a huge benefit for team consistency, not locking everyone into one tool.
Exactly. Big win for collaboration.
The article also mentioned tools like dip, briefly.
Yeah, tools like dip or similar wrappers around Docker Compose. They basically let you define shortcuts for those longer Docker Compose commands.
So instead of typing the whole Docker Compose run .command,
You might just configure dip and type, say, dip bash to get a shell or dip spec to run tests. Just simplifies the day-to-day interaction.
nice little quality of life improvement.
Definitely.
And FastRuby.io's angle on this, since they wrote the article,
Well, their whole focus is helping teams improve Rails development, performance, maintainability,
right?
and having consistent, easy-to-set-up dev environments with dev containers is a massive part of that. It cuts down on setup friction, eliminates works on my machine issues, makes onboarding faster, all things that help teams be more productive and build better apps.
Okay, so let's really try and nail down the key takeaway for everyone listening.
Cool for it.
Dev containers. Fundamentally, they're just Docker containers, but they use specific conventions, right?
Right. The dev container folder, the devcontainer.json, the way you structure Dockerfile, and docker-compose.yml.
And by following these conventions, you get a standard, reproducible development environment for your Rails app.
Exactly. Same environment for everyone on the team, no matter their OS or editor.
And the benefits go beyond just fixing works on my machine. You mentioned onboarding.
Huge. New hires can be coding in minutes, not days fighting setup scripts.
Less setup hassle for everyone means more focus on actual coding.
Yep. Less cognitive load, more flow. Plus, it makes your CI/CD pipeline potentially more reliable because it's closer to your dev environment.
So the value is pretty clear then.
Oh, yeah. Faster setup, easier collaboration, way fewer environment headaches. It's a solid investment.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. How could adopting this, even the manual Docker Compose way we talked about, streamline your workflow or your teams?
Yeah, even without VS Code's magic buttons, the consistency is powerful.
Maybe check out those wrapper tools like dip. See if that makes the commands less intimidating.
Good idea. Could be a nice middle ground.
Definitely give it some thought. We'd love to hear if anyone tries this out based on our chat. And hey, if there's interest, maybe we can dive deeper into specific aspects another time.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today.